Thanks for joining this afternoon session, for coming to my presentation. I really appreciate it. Hopefully you guys get some good info out of this. We're going to go over some stuff that the Coast Guard does. We're going to go over some of our new policies and procedures and some of the things we do in regards to cyber. And then we're also going to talk about a case study that's kind of fresh. So it'll be an interesting look at a kind of a maritime specific, the cyber maritime specific. So first thing about Sector Columbia River is it's located in Warrenton, Oregon. Marine Safety Unit Portland is in Portland. However, that's going to be changing pretty soon. So November-ish, the sector is actually moving, which means the captain of the port is moving to Portland, which is a good thing for us because they become closer to industry. So we're really happy about that. Search and rescue is priority 1 for the Coast Guard. Marine transportation recovery is priority 1A, and that includes cybersecurity, natural man-made disasters, cyber disasters, things like that. That's why we're in the cyber physical track, is because it's anything that could become physical as far as movements of vessels and things like that. That's what we're into. And then this is kind of the why, right? That last one. We're the top gateway for wheat and barley exports, as well as a major exporter of corn, bulk minerals, timber, and paper products. So I usually put this up. This is the captain of the port zone. So we're southern Washington, we're all of Oregon, and we're into the river system in Idaho. The reason why I put this up here is because, in the government, we like maps and boundaries because they generally relate to how we define our jurisdiction and who has responsibility for what and where, right? But from a cyber perspective, none of those boundaries matter. It comes in from anywhere. So this is something that the Coast Guard is just getting a handle on, that the threat landscape is much more broad than just the physical threat landscape on the maritime sense. Okay, so the recent Coast Guard cyber strategy that came out, it really deals with maritime critical infrastructure, and that's vessels, facilities, port complexes, intermodal connections, bridges, and then other components needed to operate the MTS, like grain elevators, things like that to help with commerce. And then as we found out in COVID, the people who operate these systems, because during COVID we have a pretty resilient port in that we export most of our goods, so we didn't have the same container issues that LA and some of the other folks had. But we did have some issues with the bar pilots and the river pilots and folks that are needed to move vessels. When they can't do the job, then that's a marine transportation disruption. Marine transportation system. Thank you, sorry. So think of it as a system. So the whole big thing. It's not just one state or another, right? Like Washington and Oregon have each done an RRAP, right? The Regional Resiliency Assessment Program. So they've done that for each state, and each state drives those metrics on which they're evaluating. We look at the whole thing systematically, kind of the holistic approach. So, and that's the title for that is the MTS. Okay, so this is the Marine Transportation System supply chain. I put this one together because I like the puzzle piece analogy. I had a bunch of long, strings and things, but that was a little too academic. So switch to this one. And if one of these puzzle pieces goes missing, we have a supply chain disruption. And each connection between the puzzle piece represents an opportunity for some malicious actor to come in and affect that specific portion of it. So like in the trucks and rail portion there, if there's some sort of cyber incident or something like that there, it's going to connect and it's going to affect the cargo handling and the port systems and things like that. It's going to affect vessels and when vessels can show up. And a lot of those are on really short time frames. So a cyber incident to any one of those would cause major backups. Okay, so now we're going to talk about systems in the MTS that are at risk. So this first one is the shipboard systems that are at risk. We had mentioned earlier, I was talking about some wastewater stuff. This is really similar, right? Anything that has SCADA or some sort of operational system is very similar to the shipboard system. So there's power systems, there's ballast, There's propulsion and steering. There's bridge. So in the maritime world, bridge means that's this place where you drive the boat. So it's usually on top. So each one of those has systems, and if your IT and your OT systems are not differentiated, we have big issues because these ships come from offshore. When they enter the river system, they automatically transmit all of their software updates and things like that. It's the way they're configured. So it just happens all the time. So if there's a bad guy there at the same time, then we're going to have problems. We've seen this in the past with seafarers. They've had their internet hacked, and they're doing their billing and their online billing and things like that, and they get to port and they realize that they've been cleaned out because they used that super open system that they had on the ship. So if those systems are separate from the comm systems and the propulsion systems and the power systems, we usually don't have any problems. But a lot of, we'll say it, foreign flagged vessels and things like that don't necessarily have some of the same stringent requirements or standard requirements, is probably a better way to say it. So you never know what you're going to get. So we have, the bar pilots, when they come on to bring them across the Columbia Bar, we ask them to look at different things like radar glitches and things like that to see what's going on, because we can talk about GPS spoofing and things like that. So these are the interconnected systems. So this is when the port meets the boat. So when the boat pulls up to the port, these are all the different systems that are at risk. We already know about security cameras, right? All the IoT type of things. Lighthouse controls, cranes, gate access and control, electricity, cargo handling. In our AOR here, which is area of responsibility, we have the locks and the dams. So in our case, the locks and the dams are important. Fortunately, they're pretty old school, so they're literally unplugged, which is nice. So every time we go meet them, it's a really short visit. But each of these things are at risk, especially if that ship is pulled in something bad, and then they connect to the port's systems, and then that bad will then infect potentially the port processes. And most of the ports in the region here are going to, they diversify, right? So they're going to have fuel, they're going to have bulk commodities, they're going to have break bulk, which is all the loose stuff that you put in. They're going to have steel and wood and things like that. So if all of that is affected, then their diversification is really kind of muted. So it's bad for business for them as well. Okay, so we're going to now go into some cybersecurity incidents that we've had here that we've actually worked. And then we'll go into a case study, and then we'll go in and talk about some of the things that we've got going on. Oh, that didn't work so well. Bummer. Looks like my format got tweaked a little bit. So this is essentially from August 2020 to March 2021. These are the cyber incidents that we actually responded to. Some of the most interesting ones, and the one that I don't have up here, is we have a tug operator that had somebody in their system that actually created an invoice to move tugs, and then the tugs actually moved, and the invoice was based off of another company in the river system. So that is the definition of the cyber physical, right? Like that cyber bad guy literally made ships move. And so the good question that we're trying to track down and we're looking into is, so what happens if an accident occurs if the cyber bad guy told the ships to move rather than the company? So this is an interesting deal. We're talking with, we're seeing where the insurers are with it and things like that. But this is pretty standard stuff: blue water shipping, phishing attempt, the awareness of that agent receiving the email. It really led to the avoidance of the compromise of their system. And then we have, in March 2021, a port in the captain of the port zone. I can't actually say some of these ports right now because I prefer not to. But they had an issue with the Microsoft Exchange vulnerability, and they didn't catch it. So we actually deployed our cyber protection team, which we'll talk about here in a little while, to that location, and they did some on-site work. And then IMO wasn't really a big deal. That's the International Maritime Organization. That didn't affect us too much, but it was really concerning because of the amount of data and the amount of information that they that they hold, right? Because IMO passes all the laws, and then each country adopts each of those maritime laws. So they've got a lot of things going on. False maritime phishing attempt, industry partner email spoof. At one point, even our own port state control, which is where all the vessels report to and things like that, their email account was spoofed. So you can't even trust the good guys at this point. And then the Port of Kennewick, I put that one on there just because it's not so the Marine Transportation Security Act is what we regulate, right? So that means that each facility needs to have a cybersecurity plan and a cybersecurity annex. And we're actually, over the next 6 months, starting to enforce that. Port of Kennewick it's not an MTSA regulated facility, but we do pay attention to it because there are marina facilities connect with the other ports in the region that do commodity loading and things like that. So we definitely want to keep track of that. And of course, we know about solar winds. Yeah, so the CFR dictates the regulation that the port is supposed to adhere to, and then we're the group that would, hold them to that. So in most of the cases with this, it's just going to be a notice that they missed a deadline or something like that. In the cybersecurity realm right now, we're not issuing captain of the port orders or anything like that, because the captain of the port has these, I call them 1800s era Judge Dredd authorities, right? Like they're literally old school, and they can tell a vessel that you can't move, or they can tell a port you have to stop. They try not to use their discretion, right? They don't do that, but as we're spooling this up, as we're getting ahead and working towards how we're going to regulate cybersecurity in the MTS, that's what we're doing. So let's talk about the shipyard. So this actually happened in June. We're going to call it the shipyard because I bet you they wouldn't want us to talk about it. But whatever. So they became concerned, and this is a shipyard that's in Oregon. So that's why I bring it up, because it's here. This is in our AOR, or in our area. So they became suspicious of unauthorized activity that was occurring in their network environment. They immediately engaged external cybersecurity forensic experts at Stroh's Friedberg. So that was the tip-off for us when we got the letter for this. The fact that this shipyard that has government contracts and things like that hired that firm that quickly, we knew that this was going to be a little more serious. So we paid a little bit closer attention to it. Right, so they did all their normal stuff: firewall, malware analysis, log collection, dark web scanning. So the reason why this is also interesting is because the shipyard is not an MTSA facility. So they build ships, they do all this stuff, but we don't actually regulate them. So they're not, and really what that means is that they don't have to tell us. So if they got hit by somebody, they don't have to tell us about it because they're not an MTSA regulated facility. Which is interesting because they have Coast Guard contracts and our ships go in there and things like that. So we're concerned about it, but in other ways. So the findings. So as of June 29th, core systems are back up and running. They don't currently anticipate any more negative impact to operations or timetables for customer deliverables. So that's ship repair, that's ship building, that's all the different things that the shipyard does. So they have identified evidence that the threat actor accessed their network on or about April 20th, 2022. Remember, this was June that they discovered it. I have a timeline here too that we'll go over in a second. But a domain controller and several accounts were compromised. The threat actor also deleted certain event logs and other forensic artifacts from the system, and then renamed the malware to approximate the shipyard's internal naming conventions. So pretty clever stuff. Findings continued. So they identified the presence of data exfiltration, the malware exfiltration used during May 18th through June 6th time frame. They had evidence that internal files and customer-related files and information were accessed and exfiltrated. So they're still working to prioritize, what went out, how it went out, things like that. And I think they're making notifications. So here's the timeline. April 22, threat actor gained access to the network environment. On 18 May, internal customer files were accessed and exfiltrated. 06 June, so the shipyard discovered the intrusion and was concerned about suspicious unauthorized access. They immediately employed forensic experts and legal counsel. 08 June, they took the whole system offline. 09 June, then they made their notifications to DoD, FBI, DHS, CISA. The Coast Guard learned about this through a letter, so they made notifications there as well. And then 29 June, the core systems are up and running, and over 5 terabytes of data were stolen.
And on that particular case, in spite of being down for 20 days, are they still in business?
Yes.
Wow. Are they still doing contracts with the government?
They are, which is interesting, right? Like,
You keep using that word. You do not think it means what you think it means.
right. I don't know, I think government contracts, this is a little outside my scope, but I think government contracts they're locked in, and I don't know if the government has contractually, I don't think they have any built-in clauses to escape from if there's a cyber event. I just don't think that they've thought about that far ahead.
Working on it, though.
Right. Okay, so the next thing we want to talk about is our Coast Guard cyber protection team, right? So DHS and CISA, they have these deployable units that can go out and help businesses and things like that. We have something similar, and it's going to be, they're based in Alexandria, and it says 3 teams of active duty Coast Guard, but recently they just stood up a 4th team out of LALB. So we've got a West Coast team as well, which is pretty good. So they're active duty, so they're the uniformed folks. And their main services are they do assess, hunt, clear, and harden missions, and they deploy around the world. Of course, their mission is to enhance the resiliency of the MTS critical infrastructure against cyber disruptions. And then they want to do it, and this is what we're doing as well, through proactive engagements, right? Like we're trying to be really open and honest and transparent as we grow into this, our cyber authorities and jurisdictions and things like that, so that everybody kind of knows where we're at and what we're doing, and then we can have great partnerships as we move through the process. They do their email if you do have any. There's a lot of ways to get to them, but we can go from there. But if you have a maritime cyber incident, you can't get a hold of me or the sector, feel free to just email them direct. It'll all come down through my desk at some point anyway. The captain of the port has to authorize the headquarters unit to come out. So we'll do a request for forces, and there's a whole process for that. It's usually pretty quick. The main thing that we want, though, is if you are a port, or you're a port partner, or you're a port IT team or something like that, you're going to have to get your rules of engagement documents filled out pretty quick, so that we know exactly what we're allowed to touch, what we're not allowed to touch when we get into the systems. Once that's in place, then we can do the request for forces, and the captain of the port will authorize the team to do a 2-week. 2 weeks will generally be remote, and then they'll generally do 2 weeks on site, depending on what they need. But these are the main missions that they've got. So they do assess, and that's of course penetration testing, configuration review, and then hunt. So they'll do threat hunting, and these are all like, I don't know what's the word, the boutique services, right? Like you as the victim of the cyber hack or whatnot can ask for these specific missions. So you can just do a threat hunting mission. You can just do an assess mission. You can also, so there's the clear and then also harden. So the remediation of vulnerabilities, incident response, we'll talk to all the different stakeholders and what's going on, things like that. Generally the harden comes after one of the other ones. And that way we can have some information. And then when they give the the end of the mission report, it's generally done in more of a simplified manner. The IT folks will get their technical specifications for it, but it's usually the documents are written for states, local governments, things like that, that maybe have a little bit slower, or elected officials and things like that, that aren't technical in nature. So it's written for that type of audience, so that it's a little bit easier to understand. And then they'll recommend, of course, best practices, things like that. That's usually from start of the mission to the end of the final product. Right now, they're telling us is about 90 days. So once we can get everything going, the mission, of course, starts as soon as the paperwork is finished. And then once the mission's done, that's 4 weeks. And then the rest of it's to do all of the analysis. So what if you have a cyber incident in the marine transportation system? If you're an MTSA regulated facility, we ask that you please call the National Response Center. That's how we get all of the information. The NRC will push the stuff down to the sector level, where I'm at, and they'll also push it to the headquarters level. So a lot of the times the cyber protection team will call us, and Cyber Command will call us and say, hey, we got this. And then we'll reach out to the port partner and discuss what they're looking for and kind of, broker the deal. If you're a non-MTSA regulated facility, which is really anybody that on, next to, near, associated with the water. And then we ask that you call the Sector Columbia River Command Center. You can always call or email me, but just in case, I don't want to be the single point failure, just in case I'm on vacation or something. Call the command center, they'll start the QRC, and we'll get the process started. Because we can still, even though something doesn't go through the NRC and through headquarters already, we can actually get the cyber protection team out there via our request. So this is a service that we can offer. Cyber protection team has been out to our AOR probably four times in the last year. So we're trying to use their, their agreeableness to travel out here as much as we can. So we're sending them to even small things, just small things like that. Say that again?
Do you coordinate your activities with CISA?
We let them know what we're doing, and they're on that same email chain from NRC. So in fact, that goes to the Coast Guard, that goes to FBI, that goes to CISA, that goes to everybody. It depends on once we get into the MTSA stuff. And then the interesting growing pain that we're going to have is going to be how we integrate with how CISA, if they're doing something similar and we're doing something, and if the two groups are talking or not. That's going to be something that we're going to be really tracking so that we can make it a little more seamless and it's easier for the end user to get their systems looked at. All right. Okay, so that's all I've got. I wanted to just mention real quick too that the Coast Guard is hiring. We could use a lot of uniformed folks, right? Like I'm a civilian employee for the Coast Guard, so we have lots of cyber opportunities all over the country. Where in fact we created a new position, it's just the MTS Cybersecurity expert. Cybersecurity specialist is what the position will be called. We just hired one for our sector. Puget Sound just hired one. Our district in Seattle hired one. But we have these positions open all over the Coast Guard. There's sign-on bonuses, there's things like that. So if you're a civilian that would like to work in that realm, let me know, or check out USA Jobs. That's where all of those job openings will be. And then if you're, you fit the age range and you're interested in being on the blue side of the house and being a uniformed Coast Guard's men or women, we also have the investigative specialists and intelligence specialists, and we're bringing online a new rate for cybersecurity specialists as well. So they're going to be the enlisted workforce version of what the cyber protection team is doing. So, like I mentioned earlier, the Coast Guard, sometimes we whiff on a few things, right? But in this case, I think we're doing a really good job because they're actually making the workforce and they're developing the workforce around an emerging topic, right? Like cybersecurity. It's really important. I haven't seen us move this well in a forward pass on a lot of different things. So which means that there's a lot of opportunities. So if anybody's interested in that, please let me know. And with that, I'll open it up to any questions.
Just out of curiosity, for NTS systems, what policies or standards do you follow? Do you follow DoD standards, or do you follow DHS standards, or do you have your own standards that you follow?
Well, so it's going to be the CFR, the Code of Federal Regulations, will identify which standards to follow, and then different organizations will then enforce them. So technically, the Coast Guard is part of DHS, so part of that answer is yes, it'll be DHS. But it'll be the Coast Guard that has the authority over that sort of stuff. So, and that's where we get back into the captain of the port orders and things. So you have to have an S-band and X-band radar, right, to enter the port. If one of those is inoperable and it's reported, which they're 12 hours before they have to, then we're going to not let that vessel in. Things like that. Mm-hmm. Anybody else? Awesome. Well, thanks. I really appreciate it. Enjoy the rest of your day.